series. We're pleased to work in partnership with East, Maastricht, and ASU. And the mission of this seminar series is to provide opportunities for the STIR community to learn, connect, and grow worldwide. And in this seminar series, experienced STIR researchers present and discuss their studies, which are circulated among seminar participants in advance. So if anyone had a chance to read the paper that Anthony circulated in advance, we can talk more generally about the notion of imaginaries and regional imaginaries and how that idea fits into Anthony's study. What is STIR? Well, it's socio-technical integration research, studies technical, expert, reflexive, and responsive capacities. These are capacities to be treated as a scholarly topic, but they also have potentially important significance as actual governance resources in the world. So STIR mostly focuses on understanding expert capacities to respond to a number of societal dimensions that aren't necessarily part of their formal training or part of their routine cultural practices. But STIR also seeks to explore how these capacities can be robustly or more robustly exercised. So that's where we get the notion of STIR as a capacity assessment. And finally, STIR also has sort of a side effect, and that is by studying and interacting with these capacities, STIR ends up often enhancing these capacities. And that then helps us do a better job at assessing not only how capacious the capacities are, but how they might be encouraged and supported with institutional, organizational, or managerial changes. So STIR methodology is fairly complex and detailed, but we can boil it down to three main components: the decision protocol, which is used to structure interactions, which we call dialogues or exercises. It's not really an interview protocol, it's a decision mapping protocol. The way in which we deploy this protocol and conduct ourselves as as investigators, which is tied very closely to this idea of the embedded humanist, and more generally, it's our ethos of engagement. And finally, the analytical framework of midstream modulation, which we use to analyze and make sense of the effects of the decision protocol over time. So there are numerous STIR studies that have been conducted around the world, and many of these have, I think we've had something like 80 or 81 known STIR studies in the last 10 plus years. Many of these have been published, and one of them is the subject, one of these publications is the subject of today's seminar by Anthony Levenda. Anthony is a director and a professor at Evergreen State College, and he has previously held positions at Calgary and Oklahoma City, and also ASU, as well as in Portland. And Anthony conducted and helped conduct part of a broader STIR studies project approach to understanding how STIR functions out of the laboratory. And Anthony's role in that was multiple, and not least being that he conducted three different STIR studies in the city of Portland, and they were all sort of theoretically and methodologically connected. So very pleased to have Anthony joining us today and talking about why engineers can't think about this sort of thing and the importance of reaching out to affected users. So please join me in welcoming Anthony, and we will turn the floor to him.
Okay, hi everyone. Can everybody see this okay? Great, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks for inviting me. to do this talk today. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody and to share some of this research that I haven't had a chance to think about in quite some time. If you can give me just 1 second to reorient my screen and make sure that it still looks right. Is this the wrong screen now?
Yeah, but before you had, we were seeing the full screen. Now we're seeing presenter mode.
Okay, let me, 1 second, sorry. Of course, it's gonna mess up. Let me try it one more time. Is that right now? Is this the main?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, cool, thank you. Well, yeah, I just want to say thanks for having me here today. As Eric mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Climate Action and Sustainability at the Evergreen State College, where I also teach a bunch of different courses on climate policy and action. And that's really the topic that's been motivating my work for the past 5 or 6 years, climate justice and climate politics. And so it's fun to go back and think about some of this work we did on smart cities as a project, as a part of a project called Stir Cities that I was a postdoc on while at ASU. And my part of that study focused really on 3 different cases in Portland, Oregon, and that's kind of what I'll be talking about more broadly today. But just to orient us, I'm going to kind of provide some context about what we were thinking about at the time related to smart cities. So a smart city, many of you probably have heard of this term, but the general idea as given here from IEEE is it brings together technology, government, and society to enable a smart economy, smart mobility, smart environment, smart people, smart living, and smart governance. And as you can tell, definitions like this don't really tell us much of what a smart city is. It tends to basically serve as a broad envelope in which many different technologies might be developed and applied to different urban systems, including things like smart mobility, public safety, data and analytics, smart energy, the whole world of sensors and Internet of Things, and all kinds of different civic platforms. So while the term is quite broad, it usually refers to the application and deployment of information and communication technologies and associated infrastructure, software, algorithms, and control systems to various domains of urban life, as you can see in this table that we put together with a collaborator from University of Massachusetts Amherst, Thad Miller. And typically when we think about smart cities, there are 3 dynamics or 3 enabling dynamics that we think about. The first is regulation and efficiency. So the application of these technologies help cities become highly instrumented. This makes cities networked, programmable, data-driven, and thus more knowable and controllable in dynamic and reactive ways. The second, smart cities tend to be thought of as spurring economic development through advances in ICT infrastructure and allowing more innovation and creativity and sustainability within cities. And cities here are then seen, smart cities are seen as competitive, entrepreneurial, and knowledge-driven. Similarly, smart cities are said to improve social and civic life through technology, allowing for more accountable governance, things like new forms of participation, and helping solve local, social, and civic issues. And so here, cities are then seen as shared, open, inclusive, transparent, and empowering. And the central idea behind smart city projects generally is that sensor arrays, smart meters, these different technologies that we call smart, will collect data and then feed it back to some central point where it is stored and analyzed and applied. But as many scholars have noted, there are many challenges with smart cities, ranging from ethical and political issues, questions of privacy and anonymity, how cities might become susceptible to cyber attacks, glitches, and bugs with the application of these technologies, how they tend to be marked as purely technical and neutral systems, and how they tend to portray cities as rational and controllable. And they also, there's many critiques out there that kind of describe smart cities as privileging economic interest over broader social and community benefits. So many of these problems arise from the vision of the smart city as a technical system. Excuse me, just 1 second. I need to pause for 1 second. Sorry about that. Need to let my cat out of my office. So many of these problems that I've just described with the smart city here is the view from large technology companies treating the city as something that is very controllable, knowable, and rational. So expertise here within the smart city domain is not really the problem itself. The problem is that only certain forms of technical expertise are currently guiding smart city development. And this excludes alternative forms of expertise and knowledge and experience that might not fit within this current model and culture of expertise shaping smart cities. So I think, a lot of the project with Stir Cities and my own work on smart cities was looking to try to challenge that. And I'll be talking a little bit about one way we did that. So a lot of the work I did was in Portland. And so I've been conducting, or I had conducted, a bunch of research on smart cities in Portland from about 2014 to 2017. And in this time, Portland had been going through some changes, big changes in their smart city programs. It also had been really sort of a renowned sustainable city with campaigns like the We Build Green Cities initiative shown on this slide, which was an initiative of the Portland Development Commission, who works on behalf of the city of Portland. And their idea was that they would take the lessons they learned from Portland and export their best ideas, products, and services to other cities around the world so that they too could also be sustainable. So Portland had this model and this image that they wanted to portray to the world. So a big part of that was doing different smart city projects. A pretty recent project was the city had turned attention to the application of smart technologies for improving sustainability in transportation, as well as air quality, with something called the Connected Intelligent Transit Project, which was some of the context for which I was working in the city of Portland with a STIR study. But more broadly, we saw Portland making its way into popular press with their IBM Smarter Cities initiative, where they analyzed transportation systems for more efficient and sustainable options. And the idea was to build an interactive model based on 10 years of historical data and 3,000 equations to give city officials insights into how the city should do long-range planning. So this is what IBM was doing for the city of Portland. And in his book, Anthony Townsend wrote about the significance of this IBM model in Portland for its quite lacking sort of outcomes. For all the stuff that it did with data collection, analysis, and computing, he said its greatest revelation, much ballyhooed in the company's public relations campaign for the project, was a strong correlation between the adoption of pro-bicycle municipal policies and a decline in obesity. But no one in bike-obsessed Portland needed 3,000 equations to know that. So even in 2011, 2013, when this book came out, in 2011, when that project was happening, people were already challenging the development of smart city projects. And there was a recognizable need to kind of intervene in some ways, right? Change the trajectory of smart city development and make it more applicable to people on the ground. And so that's something that I also had thought a lot about with the STIR study, is thinking about ways that we could bring in alternative viewpoints into the engineering process, into the process of actually designing the smart city. And this has broader theoretical implications, and I'll quote one person, Shannon Mattern, who is a media studies scholar, who argues that to make smart cities more equitable and human-centered, we need to grapple with problems of knowledge production. She says it's essential to make space in our cities for those diverse methods of knowledge production, and we have to grapple with the political and ethical implications of our methods and models embedded in all acts of planning and design. City making is always simultaneously an enactment of city knowing, which cannot be reduced to computation. So in her mind, smart cities isn't just the application of smart technologies, but having a better understanding of the city through multiple ways of city knowing. And in my mind, Stir Cities tried to do that in different ways. So right now I'll move a little bit more to the actual Stir studies that I did in 3 different sites. The first site was an engineering lab, where this Kanban board is a picture from that lab. And I worked alongside electrical engineers who were designing and piloting smart residential battery energy storage systems and smart grid communication technologies for application in the city of Portland. So working with engineers in this lab was important because they were actually building and designing a pilot project that would be implemented in the city. And by engaging them upstream in the process of design, while smart city systems are still being designed and built, we could help make changes that would have longer lasting effects on the actual development of this technology. And we could potentially collaborate to build smarter cities in a more integrated way, bridging sort of social and technical disciplines if we were able to collaborate. So I had 3 sort of different questions that were guiding my research in these different settings. How is technical expertise shaping the smart city? Can we open up this expertise through engagement through the STIR methods that we're using in these different sites? And then what are the impacts of an integrative approach, particularly STIR cities, on changing things on the ground? I think at a high level, the research that I'll talk about shows that certain limited forms of expertise are currently shaping smart city technologies, but there are ways to open it up and include multiple forms of expertise to change the development of different smart technologies, and that the impacts of the engaged approach are more than just the method of data collection and research. It's also a way to encourage collaboration and stimulate change. So that was something that I had gained by using the STIR approach here. So the research approach, of course, was STIR, but it was a multi-sided case study as well in 3 different areas. And we used the STIR intervention-oriented ethnographic method is the way I always talked about it in my outward-facing research to different communities. So in order to understand these different situated contexts in which different experts work, I did a multi-sided case study. And I worked in a Portland engineering lab where you can see me with the battery in the bottom right, where the engineering lab was at a public university working with an energy utility to develop that infrastructure. I worked in the city planning offices, deploying an air quality sensor network and a pilot, and developing actually smart city governance structures. They were doing this simultaneously. And then at a smart home startup company, developing software and hardware for home automation, as you can see with an app in that top right picture. So in each case, I did all sorts of stuff, including the STIR studies, but I reviewed documents and then did the interviews and additional interviews. And my own participation obviously was very important in these contexts as I sought to promote reflexivity and develop collaborations with my research partners. So this might be the most familiar photo to many of you here. I really focused on expert practices and decisions, and the interviews were semi-structured. I used this decision protocol, the STIR decision protocol, to facilitate collaborative description of the interview process, as many of you probably know. And this was meant to serve as a platform for reflection and inquiry into decisions and decision processes as they unfolded in real time. And the basic process included asking the person what they're working on, what important factors are influencing their decisions, asking what alternative approaches they could take, and asking what they think they will end up doing and why. So the goal of this approach is to both understand and change. I did weekly interviews with 3 main participants, sustained engagement with 1 individual at each site, and I interviewed them weekly for about 12 weeks. I also conducted 14 other interviews with people at the site to get a broader sense of organizational structure and the various projects that were going on in different places. In each of these different sites, I had different levels of access for observation. So for example, in the engineering lab, I could come and go quite readily because researchers and students were often in the lab all hours of the day. So I could go and observe even in the evenings while students were there and maybe the advisors were out and they were just doing the work in the lab. However, in places like the city planning offices and the tech startup, I had much more limited access for interviews. They were much more structured, arranged times, and I could observe sometimes, but only if I was permitted in advance. Through these iterative meetings and interviews, I gained rapport with the participants, and this led me to being asked to help on some aspects of their projects. So here we start to see some means of socio-technical collaboration. So between the researcher and the participant in the research, right? We were actually research collaborators in my mind. And this included doing small tasks such as writing background research on government procurement practices, or even providing some advice on how to interact with managers or how to write for academic journals. And I was asked to write a report on equity and smart city technologies, eventually with the city, coming up with this chart that I showed in the beginning as one way of classifying the different domains of smart technologies, and then using that to then think about what are the different equity implications of these different technologies shown in this chart here. So to kind of recap the findings from the research and start to answer these research questions that I laid out, I'll start kind of reviewing the things that I found while doing this studies. So the first question I had was, how is expertise shaping the smart city? Well, I found basically that different kinds of expert cultures were playing an important role in shaping the smart city, and these reinforced boundaries between social and technical disciplines, what we might call boundary work, making it more difficult to bring the social and technical explicitly together. So these expert cultures were kind of clashing at many times, and a big part of my work was to try to disrupt that. So expert cultures shaped how experts made decisions about their work, often limiting how they envisioned and the smart city and how they might be able to shape it. And then the intervention-oriented approach that I took was really trying to shed light on this and then open up for different possibilities. So throughout much of 2017, I worked alongside a new hire within the city of Portland who was leading their smart city initiatives, and I'll give her a pseudonym of Jen for these discussions. Jen is an expert in sensor technology and air quality, working on things like this shown here in the picture, which is an air quality sensor. Did her PhD studying roadside air pollution, and where she worked on low cost sensors for air quality, like the one picture here. And when I first started meeting with her, it was during our second meeting. She was reflecting on why she thought her scientific background was a really good fit for smart cities development in the city. And she said, coming from academia to the city, thinking about research, design, data management, and analysis a bit better, that's something that I feel like is helpful for smart cities work, especially at this stage because everything is pilots. With vendors coming to us, it's never turnkey solutions. They're always still working through things. And so with that, it's a good that evaluation or the part with the science comes in. So here I was reflecting on why Jen was assuming that the city government was a non-scientific space. I was starting to think about how she started to create these boundaries between her work in academia and in the city. And I found that it was largely because of these different expert cultures that were clashing with each other related to planning, city administration, versus places where technology and application to environmental problems might not be taking place, right? That she thought that was clearly the realm of academia. And this was evident in another example from her work on a sensor pilot, where she was discussing her task relating to the sensor pilot in January. And she said, at this time, they really want a technical paper as a part of this project. It will be a typical paper that I'm experienced in writing, looking at air quality data sets and detailing the advancements in the science. Yet as time progressed and the expert cultures that she was integrating into changed, things changed as well. She realized that through her own process of creating a sensor network, she was learning a lot more about the city and how to deal with smart city vendors and government processes. And so she said, we're learning different aspects about the city process in setting up a network. And then at time 3, she started thinking about back to this technical paper, and she explained that she wanted to write something to help other cities learn about low-cost sensor installations instead of just a purely technical paper. So you could see her desire to create an academic paper in the beginning, typical to what she would have produced as a postdoc or a PhD, changed over time to be something applicable to cities and to a broader learning community that was not her typical learning community before. So in this sense, I thought expert cultures were shaping smart city activities, but there was clearly some blurring between public responsibility and the scientific and technical aspects of smart city development in her work. Jen also often reflected on her role as a public official, and she often struggled with what this meant coming from academia and maybe a more hard science space to one that is more within the public, doing science for the public and within the public and for the city of Portland. She said, all of my communication is publicly available, so I have to consider that I'm using my time wisely and helping the public. So there's some sense here, of course, of responsibility of the position, but a responsibility that she felt to make a difference for the public. Yet even over time, she was continually struggling between these boundaries of public and scientific work that she was doing. She says, I'm dealing with new content, new plans, and still figuring out about how this works with the public, still figuring out how to work in the public realm and do community engagement and workshops. So you could tell that she was having sort of trouble or learning about how to integrate into new expert cultures, one that might be more social scientific or public facing versus one that might be more lab setting, we're doing like hard science, air quality sensor networks. And she troubled this boundary, right? And that was the interesting part for me as a STIR researcher, was the way that she sort of navigated this boundary between public work and scientific work and how that became problematic in her mind. But I also found that public and community engagement activities often fell to the back burner, seemingly outside her range of work and expertise. Similarly, in the engineering lab where I was working, similar boundaries were present. So I'm going to use the pseudonym of Ryan for the engineer I worked with. Ryan was working on a smart grid communications and energy storage project for residential applications, like I mentioned. And here on the right is a picture of their home, the home they used in their lab. And so this was basically a way to simulate energy demand from different devices like light bulbs, as you could see on the top of that device. You could see the different circuits and different plugs, for example. So this was their home. And so when I asked him about the installation of the system and the possibility of working more closely with the homeowner, that they would potentially be installing this battery energy storage system, he said, I feel like talking with the homeowner is out of our range because we are just electrical engineers and we're supposed to just be producing wire diagrams and stuff. So while he understood sorts of communications with affected users, with homeowners who would be having this battery energy storage system installed at their house were important, he felt like he had limited possibility for change. And so by understanding these expert cultures, I think, and the way they create boundaries that inhibit integration, we can begin to understand the limitations and think through ways to open them up, right? And collaborate as we design and build smart infrastructure systems. And so here, Eric mentioned in some of the work when I had talked about this with him, that this was an initial closure, right? This boundary work that was going on in the minds of this engineer. So the second research question I had that was guiding this project was, can we open up expertise through engagement? And basically I found yes, but there's a lot of different constraints, largely coming from institutions, but also from other more micro politics that were going on. So for example, when I was working alongside Ryan in the engineering lab, he constantly expressed concern for the direction of the project. The project and the lab was funded by a local utility directly. This limited both the scope of the projects and everyday decisions. And a manager from the utility would come to the lab weekly to make sure, to basically meet with the group and make sure they were on track and check in and give direction. And several times throughout the project, Ryan mentioned that he had to constrain certain project elements to tailor to the requests of the sponsor, even when he saw some sort of more efficient or direct or compatible or otherwise better solution. So there were institutional limitations, often the funding dictated the research, and there was little freedom to innovate in the mind of Ryan. He put it this way, he said, we're basically a private consultancy for them. So this was one way to think about the structure shaping what was possible within the STIR studies that I was doing. And throughout the testing and model building for the battery energy storage system in this engineering lab, Ryan and his team had to struggle with the siting of the project. So here you can see the wiring diagram shown here, really, really big. And then the home, really, really small on the whiteboard, right? So the idea of the home was kind of always an afterthought of something that wasn't really thought of. But when I asked Ryan about it, he said, he of course said, I feel like talking with the homeowners out of our range, because that's something we just don't do as engineers. Originally, the goal was to install the field prototype on the side of a house behind a fence to account for the aesthetics of a large battery system. But technically, this proved difficult for many reasons. And after I asked Ryan about it, if he was able to work with the homeowner, he initiated contact with him and found that the homeowner would be willing to accept a different placement for the battery bank. And this worked out to be a better solution technically, and it worked out better with the homeowner's wishes. So he was considering the preferences of the homeowner and actually speaking to him. And even a small push of asking if he could speak with the homeowner made Ryan realize that there was an ability to choose different courses of action, even within the constraints of the sort of sponsored research project that they were doing. And then eventually they had the decision to locate the stack or the battery within the garage, and this made the homeowner happier and made for a safer project, and eventually, hopefully, I think, made the energy storage system more acceptable, right, socially and publicly, because that's something we really need for combating climate change, for addressing renewable energy transitions, and making sure we have good grid stability while we do that. So while I guess the way to think about these then within the STIR parlance is thinking about each of these in terms of midstream modulation. And this is something I would defer to Eric to tell us more about maybe in the discussion, but the first would be considered de facto modulation. Then we have reflexive and deliberate, right? We see that Ryan is actually considering and making changes to the practices on his own. So similarly, back to the city study, Jen noted the pressures placed on her by the inundation of smart city vendors and by the bureaucratic structures of local government. In this case of the sensor companies, the city would have to lease sensors and the companies would manage the infrastructure and network. And essentially, she said it was like the city was just buying data from different vendors. And in this case, she felt that she had a limited role in shaping sensor deployments because it really wasn't up to her. They were just leasing these sensors and she didn't have much control. But she realized that she could also ask vendors to provide an explanation of how their projects would actually help people in Portland as a precursor to any contract with the city. So again, there's this structure that's shaping decisions, but then the participants really realizing that they have the ability to ask for different things and make changes. And this was getting her to reflect on her opportunities, while also thinking through some guidelines for future projects. And she said, we want vendors to at least tell us a real use case of whatever they are trying to sell us and tell us how it aligns with our goals like equity. So this really served to open up the process for procurement of smart city technologies in the city to the broader social values that the city is supposed to serve. The third sort of point that I wanted to talk about was related to the third research question I had for this work, which was what are the impacts of the integrative approach? And basically my third major finding was that utilizing this STIR methodology, an active intervention oriented approach, led to possibilities for collaboration. And this means that there were sometimes deliberate changes to how smart city technologies and programs were designed and implemented. And this was precisely the intention of the research in some ways, right? If you can call it an intention. And this led to collaborative engagements that could help build capacities for working across some of these disciplinary and expert boundaries that I talked about earlier, and then offer opportunities for collaboration with diverse groups of experts. So while working with the city planning office, Jen and I were discussing how community engagement activities might be integrated into the blueprint she was developing for broader dissemination. She said, I might write some of this up. Do you mind if I run it by you? I feel like you have more experience on this in your research. Do you mind? So here she's explicitly reaching out to me as not only a researcher studying her everyday processes, her everyday decisions, but someone that she then sees as a potential collaborator with expertise, in this case for me, which was social science. And so she was thinking that I would have a better understanding of how to think about public engagement and social impacts of the technology. When I asked her about the meetings for time, she provided this example. And I think this was one example where I saw a collaboration between her and I emerging. She said one piece that we talked about after reflecting on this more, she said one piece that we talked about, the complicated part with smart cities, that we have some of the projects pretty fully baked and it didn't really have this communication and engagement aspect to them. But as we try to figure out what projects are next and what we want to do, things that meet the needs of underserved communities, we need more information about what their needs are. And this was the space where she thought that she could reach out for more collaboration across different kinds of expertise. And so it was clear that our conversations about the public aspects of her work impacted how she envisioned her work on smart cities. And no longer was it just about evaluation and data and writing scientific papers, but it was about working with people who were most in need. And so as a part of this, we ended up developing a equity framework for smart city projects that we piloted with her in the city. This is something I did with a collaborator at the time, Thad Miller, who was previously a co-director of the Center for Smart Cities and Regions at ASU. But basically, we had then actually developed different kinds of equity frames that she could apply to future smart city projects based on the work that we had done with her and the work that she wanted to continue doing in the future. So this was one way that we were able to sort of build collaboration and consider the broader impacts of smart technology development in the city. One way that she described this was that she felt really comfortable on how to define data and technology and improving people's lives. She had those, and then the last part was defining underserved communities. And she said, I was like, whoa, wait, what is our real definition of that? It should be obvious that I should not be doing these things on my own outside of my expertise. After speaking with the community outreach office, it worked out really well. We had a great discussion. It was also really difficult. It was the first time I was going to standing in the room and saying, like, we're going to lead with a racial equity lens. So for her, it was a really big deal to start considering the broader impacts of smart city technologies and implementing that in her work so that the actual like dimensions, the goals of the work were no longer just about data and technology, but actually now the goal of her work for smart city technologies was leading with a racial equity lens. So we could see some really big changes just in a few months of engagement in the way the project was going. And of course, we can't take full credit for that because this is at a time, obviously, and you could see September 25th, 2017 in the United States, where there was lots of things going on considering racial justice and racial equity. So it wasn't just the project, but I think the ability to open up the smart city sector to thinking about how we can apply it to some of the most pertinent social and public issues of the time was clear. So overall, I found that we can see ways smart cities are embedding and normalizing certain forms of expertise, which also constrain pathways for alternatives, but that experts have the capacity to change during the process of design and implementation. And we can collaborate with experts, we as STIR researchers or social scientists, to open up design and decisions for more equitable, citizen-centric approaches to smart cities. And as the case of the city of Portland shows, we can build collaborations to rethink smart cities as they are being developed actively. If we get in there, if we get the right networks built, and there are opportunities for implementing an integrative approach by identifying the boundaries of expert cultures and enhancing reflexivity. So the case of the engineering lab in my mind also shows us the need for more extensive engagements to open up the sort of structures and funding limitations and institutional constraints that experts in various settings, and the need to create the space or platform for more open and engaged experimentation and collaboration. So while so some of the broader implications in my mind were that we can engage experts to open up the smart city in the making, but we need more engagement, collaboration, and experimentation to make sure that we don't get stuck in those sort of one-sided views of smart technology development. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen and take any questions, or maybe we can just move to a broader discussion. And I'm happy to refer back to slides if folks have particular questions.
Fantastic, Anthony. Thank you so much for that brilliant presentation. Very, very pleased to get your your reflections on that, and really glad that you provided a broader context for how the STIR methods and results fit in to sort of a broader analytical lens, a broader social view, and that's very, very appreciated, and I think very clearly and convincingly done. So in a sense, the STIR Cities project was a concerted attempt to really place and to interrogate the place of these types of interdisciplinary or pre-disciplinary collaborations that are that STIR is an example of methodologically, but also in terms of their questions and their effects and results. So I see we've got a number of hands raised. We've also got some questions in the comment. Let's start with Puga, and then move to Marika, and then if anybody else wants to raise their hand, great. Otherwise, you can put your comments in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony, for a great presentation. It was very interesting. So one of your findings is that expert cultures has some shaping, has some influence in how people do their work. But it seems that you can divide, and then you have this division between just doing science as typically is done, and then you have some kind of public engagement, right? But it seems that you can actually divide even more the public engagement. There were two sorts of engagement. There was one with the potential users or users of this technology, and the other which had more like educational or sort of information transfer with the public. So I wonder if you divided your results, or if you, first of all, if you made this division between these kinds of subculture, if I may, and if so, if you divided your results to see how they fit each of these different public engagements.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, I did not subdivide further, but I can see how that would be a really useful way to think about classifying different kinds of like social scientific expertise. In my mind, I was going for the highest level, right? I was trying to like see how in each setting. So they're in the three different cases. I didn't really talk about the startup at all today, which I'd be happy to talk about the startup a little bit and kind of what I found there. But in the engineering laboratory, where there was the sort of divide between even the ability to talk to homeowners where a large battery energy storage system might be placed, and then in the context of the city, which was developing the smart city program related to air quality sensor networks, there were two different audiences as well, right? So I think like the way that we can think about expert cultures in both of them has to be context dependent, but in the case of the engineering lab, it was like very much a single homeowner, right? Like this is where the battery energy storage system will be placed, and therefore it took some pushing, but eventually they talked with the homeowner and said maybe we can come up with some different solutions here, and that was the sort of midstream modulation that I had showed on the slides. In the application in the city, we see that the public generally within the city of Portland was the audience, right? That somehow everybody would be served or potentially impacted by the development of these large scale air quality sensor networks. But the thinking as it progressed was that, well, actually some communities might be impacted more. Some communities might not want these smart city, these air quality sensors in their neighborhood. They might not know what they are. So there was this information and education sharing aspect to show, hey, maybe we need to do a better job of telling people these aren't just like cameras watching them, but actually these are ways of telling you what your air quality is more resolutely in your neighborhood. And that was the sort of push behind, like, hey, let's have this equity lens applied to this. So we know that we're geographically dispersing these sensor networks equitably in areas maybe where there is potentially more pollution, in areas where there are communities who have been historically marginalized by environmental pollution, for example. And so that was the kind of push that had happened in each of those settings. And so definitely different expert cultures, but also just different audiences and publics who might be engaging with the technologies themselves that were being developed. Does that help answer the question? I don't know if I got to the theoretical bit, but yeah.
No, yes, thank you, definitely. I at first I didn't catch that it was only one homeowner which they were talking to. Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe their reflexive awareness regarding the technical decisions was different regarding their engagement with the homeowner and regarding their engagement with the public in general. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
for sure.
Let's clarify some. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks for your question. Improving your response, Anthony and Marika.
Yeah, many thanks for this presentation. Really interesting to learn more about the cities, Steer Cities project. And I have many questions, but I'll just start with two for now. And one is basically leading back to what I mentioned before this talk. So if we think about the city as actually the place or the entity or the community in which we want to build capacities for socio-technical integration, what would be your suggestions to continue from here? Because of course, in a way you did case studies, you interacted with specific people, but would you now say, if we want to build capacities in cities, then this means just steer more people? Or does this mean looking for brokers among our steer participants who can spread reflexive practices? Or does this mean, and this is, I think, I found that insight pretty interesting, that you say, you know, we need steer as groundwork in different communities, and then actually we start other types of collaboration. So I'm curious to hear more about this. And then my second question is actually related to Puga's questions. And since you mentioned already that you could tell us a little bit more about the startups, I was wondering, since there is now in the responsible innovation field a lot of literature on engagement in competitive environments and how this has particular challenges. And I was wondering also whether you saw that in these three different cases, there were really different conditions for building capacities that you needed to take into consideration, such as questions about openness, for example, which is, I think, the go-to case when we talk about companies. Yeah, so these are my questions.
Yeah, those are really good questions. So the first question about building capacities for reflexivity or for reflexive change in a city. If you take the city as a community, I think your point about like finding brokers makes a lot of sense. For this study, it was more about to be perfectly honest, I think, and transparent, is that the opportunity to work with somebody arose who was in the city. And so a lot of times in research, right, we try to build the perfect research project, but in reality, what we have is what we get. And in this case, I think we got really lucky because we did work with someone who was actually leading the smart city development project in the city, right? And so for us, that was a unique opportunity, I think. But I also think that it really depends on how we defined who the public is, who might be affected, right? Like, so if you're wanting to make broader change within the city, it's likely that working with city government is a good idea. But it also might be equally right that working with an engineering company that is designing and building a new infrastructure project in the city might also be more impactful, right? And so I think it really depends specifically on what you're trying to apply the STIR method to and what kind of changes, where you think the change might happen and have broader impacts. So this question between like STIR methodology and broader change, or STIR methodology and more systems level change or systemic change, then I think that's a question I think can only be addressed through like application and finding out what happens. But also you could do the groundwork of finding those, like you said, brokers or people in specific positions of power, really, who you might be able to work with, right? And participate in the STIR study. I don't know if that really answers the question all that well, or if it's helpful, but that's my take on the first question. For the second question, we deliberately tried to find different settings in which smart city technologies were being developed, so that we can kind of differentiate the levels of reflexivity that were we were observing in each of the different settings, right? So in the university lab, that was working with a private or with a public utility, obviously the city government, and then a startup were very different settings, both for doing research, like I had mentioned in the beginning of the talk, but also for expectations of change. And like you said, a competitive startup was probably the least, although had the most probably like ability to change because it was small, sort of like nimble, I guess you could say, and had the person I was working with was a major owner of the company and also an engineer, could make changes at will, right? Pretty much. But in my experience, they were much less open to change because of the competitive environment, right? So they were competing with people like Amazon, right? Like, and trying to partner with big companies in order to develop and scale up their technology. So in my mind, I think, although it seemed like I would expect a lot of change and reflexivity to happen in the startup environment, it seemed to be the place where it happened maybe the least. It also had the least amount of engagement time with that person because they were more guarded with their time. It was really a favor of them to let us work with them as researchers. And then in the university lab is probably where I saw the most reflexivity, and I don't know if that was because it was a pilot project. Also, the city project was also a pilot project, so there was a lot of room for change. But I think maybe the barriers in the city project also had stricter timelines, more public attention, and maybe more scrutiny than the engineering lab at the university. So I would say in each of those cases, we saw different levels of reflexivity. I was working with different folks, and the contexts were very different for being able to make changes.
Thank you for that round. I'm copiously taking copious notes now in case I have a chance to ask Anthony some questions, and maybe we can return to some of the questions that Puga and Marika have been asking. But I want to go now to the chat. So Lyric has asked a question early on during the talk. She asks, Anthony, during your study, were you working from a STIR/STIR 2.0 approach? Excuse me. Did you make that distinction between STIR and STIR 2.0? And just to bring Anthony up to speed, this is something I'm sure you remember we talked about, and you'll have to recall whether to what extent this and if so how it influenced your work. But that's been an increasing topic of emphasis in the STIR training and STIR research since the time we did the STIR Cities project. And so I can elaborate more on the differences there if anybody needs me to. And so Lyrics asks, for example, did you point out to the participants the presence of boundaries between experts and expert cultures? Or, right, so this would be sort of a STIR 2.0 move where you say, here's some information I've observed or that I know about that you may not know about. I'm going to introduce that. I'm going to ask you to think about this concept or ask you to reflect on these observations or these ontologies in your network. For instance, these users you haven't mentioned. So did you actually introduce information or did you allow it to emerge, and only if it emerged then it became a topic of genuine observation as opposed to input?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's pretty tricky for me. It's been a while since I did this project to recall exactly. And I also think it's hard. In a lot of the settings, they were very, we were just talking. And I was drawing on a piece of paper when we were talking. So they were interviews, they were structured in some ways, but really semi-structured. And it would be hard for me to say like that, whether or not they introduced it or I introduced a particular bit. But typically I would say there were particular instances where I probably had said something that and introduced a new idea into the mind of the participant who I was working with, in the sense that I might have said, it's hard, like I was thinking about the racial equity component, right? Because at the time, it'd be hard not to talk about racial equity. I mean, in the setting in Portland, and the end of 2016, early 2017, the city was moving towards a broader racial equity lens for everything, for all city operations, including city planning. And so it was kind of like just there. And so it's hard for me. I probably said something, but I don't remember exactly. I'd have to go back to look in my notes and see who said it first for that example, right?
Exactly. And we do have, excuse me, I think Jen Richter and I have looked at the transcripts carefully from your work with that question in mind. So my recollection is I'm pretty confident that at the time you were methodological, Anthony, in really kind of restraining yourself from introducing new topics and ideas and nudges and suggestions and recommendations. So my recollection is that it was a STIR as opposed to a STIR 2.0 approach. But for folks that aren't familiar, one of the things we do is follow a few methodological precepts to try to keep something in the STIR rather than the STIR 2.0 mode. But that includes noting when it does go into STIR 2.0. So we just simply are accountable to ourselves, our participants, to our community, our scholarly community, if and when we do introduce topics. But let's stay with that a little bit longer, and let's maybe call to mind the case that you presented of the midstream modulation sequence with the engineer, who at first recognized in theory and in principle the value of speaking to homeowners about who are potentially affected by engineering decisions, but then quickly said, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I don't think that's part of my job. And then gradually thought, well, maybe I can do it, and then actually did it, and then ended up using the information from his interaction with the homeowner to address this problem that they had been working with, about where best to site the installation. So I guess my question in that case would be, did you introduce the idea that, hey, there's a homeowner here, shouldn't you be talking to him? Or was it the engineer who really mentioned, when you were asking probing questions, he mentioned, or the engineering team was the ones that said, oh, well, there's also the homeowner, we could in theory consider their perspectives, right? Which would be more of a STIR as opposed to a STIR 2.0 approach.
Yeah, this is refreshing my memory a little bit. I think I was operating under STIR. I don't think I was around for STIR 2. I mean, I hadn't been introduced to STIR 2.0 in my trainings. Like when I was learning about STIR and how to apply it, it was very much more like they say something interesting and I ask them a question about it. And that was the case with the engineer, right? Like in the sense of, okay, I'd be like, okay, so he would say, we're going to locate it on the side of the house. And I said, oh, why are you going to locate it on the side of the house? And he would talk about, homeowner preference to have it behind a fence. And then eventually I think they asked about the preferences of the homeowner became something that they would start to consider. And then they started to think about, I asked them eventually about, so did you consider the preferences of the homeowner? That kind of thing, after they had mentioned it, right? I don't think it was me saying, does the homeowner want it in the garage over, or somewhere else on his property or their property? Or is it that was just the best design decision at the time for you? Yeah, so I think I was operating in the STIR 1.0 or original STIR, where I tried to be more hands-off without suggestion. But again, that felt like maybe in some cases a little bit blurred. Like I had mentioned, it's kind of hard to recall exactly because, I gained rapport with these folks. I was talking to them like normal people and just having conversations with them. And so eventually it becomes hard to, keep that really strict, don't say this or don't say that kind of mentality. So I don't know if that's the right answer but that's just the truthful answer, I guess.
That answers my question, Anthony. I definitely relate to that blurred aspect. And for me, I really think about the intention of the research study when you're first setting out. So, you know, if you were setting out to have a STIR 2.0 approach, and then one of your goals was to introduce topics, then it would clearly be on that side. But yeah, I often find that topics come up organically during the conversation, and then you just ask follow-up questions and it goes from there.
Great. Thank you guys for that exchange. Anders, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a philosophical question. So because I'm a philosopher, so bear with me. It may or maybe not be something that you can readily answer. I work with engineers at my faculty here in Oslo every day, so I kind of relate to what you're telling me about this degree of, or various degrees of reflexivity in various knowledge domains and various contexts. But I was wondering, during your interviews, were there, I mean, it's, from my experience, it's relatively easy to get engineering mindset-oriented scientists to engage in normative questions and to be more reflexive about that. They're relatively easy to get going on that. But what's way harder is to get them to be reflexive or engaging reflexivity about more hard-held assumptions related to what's, you know, relevant, valid knowledge that we should apply. So I was wondering, did you see any kind of recurring patterns on where you see that it's really hard to engage in certain levels of reflexivity, where you see that this is something that they are so embedded in that it's just hard for them to lift their perspective a little bit? I don't know if that's possible for you to answer.
I mean, that, I'll just say what that triggered in my mind. I don't know if it's going to answer perfectly the question, but certainly I remember in the startup experience that there were some very unmoving principles, such as like this needs to be profitable and scalable. So it was actually not the engineer, maybe not the I mean, that obviously is part oftentimes of the engineering design process, right? Those motives, but those were certainly things that could not be challenged, right? So and in fact, the only thing that you could say that might challenge or would be acceptable and change was if you increased like profit and scaling, right? So if the ideas did not contribute to maintaining or increasing that, then there was very little reflexivity around that. And that's, I mean, obvious, that's like kind of obvious, right? But I do think that informs engineering more broadly, engineering practice, right? I don't know about engineering philosophy, but engineering practice certainly is dictated oftentimes by, in the sense of the engineering laboratory, right? The funding was from the public utility. So it was very much, the public utility was very hands-on, right? They'd come into the lab every week and making sure that the project was progressing and staying on time, that they were going to have a pilot that they could talk about with their shareholders at some point, right? Pretty soon. So those kinds of things seem to be the most unwavering, right? Those were the things that were the strongest when it came to loss of capital, I think, loss of money, right? And so that to me seems like a really strong piece that there wasn't much reflexivity around. I would say there was also some bits around technical efficiency, right? So like efficiency is gospel in engineering land. I'm an engineer. I was trained I have my bachelor's in mechanical engineering and I have my master's in environmental engineering. And even in both of those disciplines, efficiency is gospel. And so that's it, you know, like if it's not efficient, it's not a good solution. And that certainly was something that I noticed as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of, those are the things that I found for sure. Not surprising, probably.
No, I think it's a great question and really a helpful answer, Anthony. And I think there's sort of at least two dimensions we can tease out. One is the difference between general questions, whether normative or epistemological, where, you know, we can talk to engineers, scientists, and other technical experts about, you know, well, gee, how does knowledge fit into society? How does it how do these things work together, whether from a normative or an epistemic or an economic standpoint. It's one thing to have a general discussion, but then when it comes to, okay, what about your work and your practices and your decisions that you're making today? What about your project and what you're working on? This more specific or applied, right? Sort of the more theoretical discussion, I think it's generally easier to have than the more applied question. And that's one dimension. The second dimension would be, this idea that's been around for a while in technology assessment and learning. Scoobiers brought it into stir and midstream modulation, and that is first and second order reflexivity, right? So first order reflexivity might have to do with, the goals that are already baked into the system, whether it's cost, profitability, scalability, or efficiency, or objectivity. All right, whatever goals or sort of whatever the engineers or the scientists already care about and are willing to talk about openly and be reflexive about, because they want to be more, effective at achieving their own stated goals. And then a sort of second set of goals that comes from reflecting on those goals, second order, right, which is more of a metacognitive position, where one observes and potentially critiques the goals in the system and maybe what goals are missing, or what goals are present, or how are those goals conceptualized. This is, I think, also similarly a more difficult, rarer type of reflection. It can happen, of course, but these might be trajectories over time. In STIR, we try to avoid these general theoretical abstract conversations because they're almost deflecting themselves. They deflect from the practices, which is what we're trying to engage with. Whereas on the opposite strategic end of things, we tend to start with the first order and then use that as a base from which we get second order. So that's kind of my take on how Andrew's question fits into STIR methodological ideas. But let's go back to the chat, and then we can follow up with any further questions. So Cynthia asks, Anthony, do you have any additional background on Jen, the policy, the city policy maker, sort of the city planner person, her discussions with the community outreach office to bring in the equity lens? For example, what equity-related follow-on actions occurred through these discussions if your study covered this? And then she says, thanks, you already answered my question. So sorry, I'm just getting up to speed with the chat now. I don't know if Cynthia, you've got a follow-up question, or Anthony, you wanted to add something additional to that?
I didn't have a follow-on question, but if there is anything additional that Anthony wants to add, that would be welcome.
Thanks for that question. Thanks for that question. Excuse me. I think there was a lot of work that had happened after that, and I was just going on the internet to find the link, but there is a racial equity platform that you could find in the city of Portland that they applied specifically to their smart city program. I'm not sure, like I said, I'm not sure it's definitely not directly attributable to me or our work specifically, but there was probably some impetus behind what we did to describe the specific aspects of the smart city project and how that might be related to racial equity and the way you developed it. But certainly it was more about just having those discussions, and then having that person I was working with walk across the building to the person in the community outreach office and really come up with a plan for how do we engage communities that we haven't engaged well, and how do we do it specifically for this project that I'm working on. And so there was a collaboration built within the city, I think, after we had been talking a lot about the impacts of smart technologies on the public. So I think there was some dimension there that, just having an outsider there to talk to me as the outsider within the city planning office, working on smart city technologies and asking probing questions, then that might have helped facilitate that collaboration between the two different departments within the city. Now, if I wasn't there, would that have happened? I'm not sure. It probably would have eventually, but maybe, you know, we sped it up, or maybe there was some other impact that we could have. It's hard to really measure. That's another thing that for the STIR community discussion, we could probably talk about this all day. Like, what is the impact and how do you attribute it? Probably something that you all have grappled with in different ways as well. But yeah, I'll just stop there and say thanks for that question.
Great, thank you, Marika.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the question that Eric mentioned earlier in relation to the other paper you wrote on sociotechnical imaginaries. So if you think back to that paper and the diverging imaginaries you identified comparing Phoenix to Portland, so to what extent can actually now this discourse on imaginaries and these, yeah, you could almost say maybe, yeah, certain kinds of structures that come with that, or conditions in a way for the STIR intervention. So how did you engage with that? How did this analysis of imaginaries also inform your STIR studies? So I would be curious to hear more about that. And then the second question is very much about, yeah, just your biography, or so to what extent did STIR influence your career now, yeah, basically since 2017? How does this still play a role? How do you work with the approach? Yeah, curious about that.
Thanks for those questions. In relation to the imaginaries piece, I think that was, for us, a big part of framing up the STIR Cities study was that we were positing that there are very different contexts and imaginaries that are shaping how technologies get developed in different parts of the world, whether that be related to public responsibility, environmental principles, those sorts of things. And so the context in which we were thinking about it and the way we tried to frame it was with this idea of socio-technical imaginaries, which we saw as not strictly national, right? Like a lot of times when we thought there was the national discourses of national security, containing the atom, those kinds of things, right? For us, we saw differences arising between places in the Southwest United States and the Northwest United States. And that's really where the paper emerged from, and also the context for the STIR Cities study. So I would say, in terms of actually doing the STIR studies, was I able to pull out different dimensions that would be related to those broader imaginaries, even at the regional level? I think there was, especially if you look at similar types of settings between, say, the public, the governmental official that folks worked with. I mean, the nonprofit official that was, or the nonprofit worker who I'm blanking on the person exactly, in Arizona versus, for example, the city official in Portland. You could definitely tell there were some similarities, but there were definitely differences in the way that they thought about like public responsibility and those kinds of things that maybe were shaped by broader imaginaries in those settings. I don't know how better to answer that, but I think Eric has been working on that a little bit more, and so I'd invite him to also chime in there, and then maybe I could talk about the STIR impact on my life.
Yeah, let's pick up this idea of imaginaries. This was a challenge we set for ourselves at the beginning of the STIR Cities project, and we grappled with it and have been grappling with it ever since. And that is, what's the connection, if anything, between, on the one hand, socio-technical imaginaries, which largely operate or are analyzed at the level of the nation state, on the one hand, and these interdisciplinary collaborations and their effects on the other. So it's a classic macro micro structure agency question, if you will, but we, I think, built several bridges, analytical, theoretical bridges, for thinking about and analyzing our data in terms of these broader structures. And one of the key moves was laid, the foundation was laid in this paper that we distributed that Anthony was lead author on, where we introduced the idea of regional socio-technical imaginaries, right? Portland and Phoenix might both be operating under the same national socio-technical imaginary, but there are also differences that are not simply attributable to geography and history, right? One can also sort of say that there's this more differentiated, lower level imaginary. And Jen Richter often uses the language of lenses, right? So these regional imaginaries refract the national imaginaries, So this is a very, innovation studies friendly way of looking at things using multi-level perspective or MLP. And then you can come down further from sort of the national imaginary down to the regional imaginary, and you can, this is maybe a little more controversial, we can jump all the way to sort of the imagination, right? Where we're not talking about a social imaginary, but we're talking about an individual moral imagination. However, one of the areas that I think we really want to develop in this paper we're working on now is maybe a finer distinction between regional imaginaries and moral imaginations, and that is the imaginaries embedded in organizations and expert cultures, right? That these are an additional lens that refract, the narrative scripts, shared imaginaries, commitments, institutional arrangements, which are largely durable and unchanging. However, it's in the interpretation of those, and it's the performance of those, which can vary. And so this seems to be a very interesting system variable, if you will. And I think this would be very interesting for Marika in her study of tech ecosystems, and the work that she's doing in Aachen and planning to do in Aachen, namely that, as you sort of come down, to use this horrible, spatial metaphor of high and low, macro and micro, and I say that tongue in cheek just because it's we're in adopting this multi-level perspective. We're both gaining analytical facility, but we're also limiting our analytical reach. But if we adopt it or something similar to it, then we can say that as you move from macro to meso to micro, and maybe these finer distinctions between meso and micro, we gain flexibility. It's very interesting, right? Sort of a different type of Collingridge dilemma. It's less of a dilemma because it's harder to intervene into landscapes. It's a lot easier to intervene into practices. But so there's more flexibility, I think, ultimately in the interpretation and the performance of local, cultural, organizational imaginaries than there is of interpreting regional, than there is of interpreting and performing national. And maybe the emphasis really is that it's the interpretation and the performance that are resources for change. And then the question becomes, how do you identify and locate and engage with these, or encourage them to open up? This was sort of Marika's first question. And do you do that through more STIR studies? Do you do that through additional collaborations built on the STIR studies? Do you do that through enrolling brokers? Do you do that in other ways? Yes, yes, yes. But I would offer that as sort of the beginnings of a theoretical account that we're Jen, Anthony, and I are trying to put together right now.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you for stating that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got about 8 more minutes, so let's go to Anders.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. I think it's super interesting what you say about the regional and the national versus local imaginaries. And I was just it's just a point of reflection that I attended now. I've been part of 2 EU consortiums on smart cities and urban planning. Participated in a few conferences around in Europe on that. And it struck me when you talked about this difference between national and regional imaginaries that I was shocked by attending these conferences with my colleagues from my faculty. They're all engineers in different domains. We went to one conference, and I think it was in Sevilla, I can't remember. And we participated in 2 days of presentations from consortia from other areas of Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, where the notion of urban planning and smart cities were deeply embedded into the paradigm of urban planning and urbanism, which was much more of a focus on a system level and a complexity-oriented approach to try to solve societal challenges embedded into this concept of smart cities. And I was just looking at my colleagues, and they were just kind of like, they haven't even had any concepts of what they were talking about. They have a completely different viewpoint and didn't have any kind of, they could really talk Esperanto. There was no interaction or really kind of interlocking of these 2 forms of paradigms of thinking about city planning and urbanism and smart cities at all. So that was just kind of a fascinating comment. It was fascinating to me to see that kind of lack of interconnectedness in Europe. So it was just an interesting kind of comment on what you were saying. Yeah.
I think it's a very apropos comment, because I think that's one of the things we learned from Anthony's study, his multi-sided study, is that, you know, even though there are these incredibly important, influential social, institutional, organizational, and cultural structures that do shape research and innovation, and they do constrain broader inclusiveness and anticipation and reflexivity and responsiveness. Nevertheless, there are these weird opportunities for experts to realize that midstream and to open up to alternative options, alternative possibilities. I think Anthony stressed that at the beginning of his talk, that you know, maybe the big shift in these STIR studies from T1 to T2 is T1 is, I really don't have any discretion here. I don't have any decision power here. And T2 is, well, actually, I can choose to do things differently, right? And that's really the fundamental, the sort of the leverage, the fulcrum, you know, to play with, you know, the Archimedes, give me a, you know, a lever and a place to stand and I will move the world, or, you know, give me a lab and I will shape as well. Give me, you know, this kind of situated, reflexive, reflexivity inducing collaborative description of expert practices, and you might see the experts then modulating their practices. Very interesting. And so I think this is apropos to Andrew's point about the regional and national and cultural and geographical differences in mindset, imaginaries, structures, doability. You know, this points to the contingencies that actors have, right? But that they rarely realize. And then I think in STIR, we're going down to this next level. The research question becomes not, are there these contingencies, but how can those who are involved in performing them and reproducing them do so differently? And, you know, what resources do they have? What capacities do they have to rethink, reenact, re-engage, reinterpret the imaginaries, so, or, you know, the structures that they're operating within? I think it's really a very interesting topic that we can contribute to. And building on that, I guess I'd like to introduce one or two questions very quickly, and Anthony can choose how he responds to them. One is just, I've been asked before outside the US by people who are familiar with power engineering and utilities, how was it that this engineering team in Portland was able to essentially go against the wishes of the sponsor? The sponsor didn't really care what the homeowner thought, had an idea of where they wanted the battery installation. The engineering team weren't sure if that was really the best place for it. Talking to the homeowner really helped tip the balance when they decided, no, it really has to go in this other place. And so, you know, I've been told that, for instance, in Eastern Europe, there's no way an engineering team operating as a consultancy would ever have that freedom. And then the second question is, you know, building on Puga's observation about different expert cultures or subcultures, which is sort of the de facto modulation level, right? We start with these different types of constraints and closure mechanisms and closure moments. Well, conversely, when we do have these deliberate modulations, where the engineering team relocates the battery, or where the city planner engages and reframes her research and develops you know, her work in a new direction, do we also have sort of sub-themes of rethinking and re-engaging with those expert cultures, right? In STIR, we just call those modulations deliberate modulations, and we classify the modulations, but we don't necessarily classify them in terms of different strategic responses to similar or different structural barriers. So I'll just leave it at that and let Anthony close us off.
Thanks for that. For the first question, I think the best way to think about it is that it's a pilot study, so there was opportunity for change, right? The engineering consultant, the university lab, which was acting as an engineering consultant team, was essentially testing how to deploy this battery energy storage system on a residential for residential purposes, controlled by the utility, of course. And typically, I would say, yeah, I would agree that within power engineering, there's very little opportunity for experimenting or changing. But since this was a pilot, I think that was the context in which that would be the way I would typically respond to that. But also that the solution they proposed was more technically, it had better efficacy for the utility as well, because they reduced the amount of distribution wire that was needed to tie it back to the grid. So there was some benefits from an engineering perspective that made the project better. I think the bigger problem was they just didn't think it was possible to locate it inside a garage, whereas that requires some level of you can't just use eminent domain to put it in a garage, right? You need the homeowner's permission to do so. So I think that was the tough part. The second question, I would say, I think for me, I always just kind of think about it in terms of boundary work, right? I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but that's the kind of way I think about it, is that they're expanding they're kind of adjusting the boundaries of where they think they can operate. So for example, in the city, it was more about changing the way they just classify the project, right? So it was still the same project. It's still a smart sensor network for air quality, but now they're just thinking about how it affects different users differently and how they can engage and inform them, and maybe shape the distribution of those sensors or the type of city contract that they get in with a certain company. And so that was the level of change. So I don't know if it's change necessarily their expert cultures in a way, but maybe. But really, for me, it was thinking a little bit more about boundary work. Where can I expand to say that, hey, maybe this engineering project should have broader public consideration of impacts, and that maybe is pushing some of the boundaries rather than just pushing forward with the most technically efficient solution. And then I'll just end by responding to Marika's question about how STIR impacted me more broadly, if that's appropriate. Is that okay if I answer that one too?
Please do.
Okay. And so for me, I guess STIR was really informative for when I was finishing up my PhD on smart grids. Obviously I was looking at social political aspects of smart grid development in different cities in the U.S. And I was, interviewing folks, but I didn't have that embedded insights. And so for me, STIR was really cool to actually, spend more time with engineers who were designing systems that I wouldn't have gotten in a different research approach. And I think it did shape my trajectory a little bit, both in terms of how I studied smart cities moving forward in my postdoc in Calgary, and then also in another postdoc I did at ASU with the lab called Re-Engineered, that's led by Darshan Karwat, which is really about challenging engineering practice to be more socially responsible, really changing what we do engineering for, right? So certainly it impacted me in those dimensions, as leveraging an opportunity to be more involved and sort of intervention oriented in the research I was doing. I would say today I don't use the STIR approach very much anymore. I do lots of case study work, that kind of stuff, on the ground interviews with climate justice movements and participatory planning type stuff. But certainly I could see it being relevant for future work that I would do on any of those topics as well. So yeah, it's definitely made an impact on my career for sure.
Well, I want to thank you, Anthony, very much for a really fine and stimulating presentation and discussion. Thanks all the participants for attending and for your great questions. And we look forward to continuing the conversation next month when Puga and Carlos will be presenting their work. So really excited about that. Hope everyone has a wonderful Friday and a